Welcome to another episode of Progress, Potential, and Possibilities, discussions with fascinating people designing a better tomorrow for all of us. I'm your host, Ira Pastor.
Welcome, everybody, again to another episode of the show. Today, bringing another really fascinating guest involved in science and technology, creating a better tomorrow for all of us. Today, we have the honor of being joined on the show by Dr. Blythe Adamson, who is head of outcomes research and evidence generation at Flatiron Health. Her work is focused on developing these really interesting deep learning language models for extracting clinical details from electronic health record documents, ultimately learning from the experience of literally millions of patients that they have in their databases with cancer, as well as generating evidence for treatment effectiveness, as well as value for various payers around the world. Dr. Adamson is a scientist as well as an epidemiologist and an economist. She's been involved in co-inventing various clinical decision support tools to benefit cancer patients in the clinic. She served as a lead data scientist in the West Wing of the White House. And then through her company, Infectious Economics, she's been involved in advising various public and private institutions of all sorts in terms of various health strategies, both on the policy front as well as the clinical front. Dr. Adamson holds degrees in microbiology, epidemiology, and pharmaceutical economics with a focus on infectious disease prevention, that are masters in public health, as well as her PhD, University of Washington. And there she also still lectures as an affiliate assistant professor. And Dr. Adamson has also held roles in the past at the Gates Foundation, as well as at NIAID, per their HIV vaccine trial network. A lot to get into today, a lot of really interesting and cool topics. Really honored to have with us Dr. Blythe Adamson. Thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
That's great having you. Really great. I'm really looking forward to the discussion, and I know I'd love to start. I know we're going to be getting into oncology and EHRs and all that stuff, but your story, quite interestingly, starts with HIV. And I really, as with all our guests, I enjoy going back into literature. Your honors thesis was on escape mutations and elite suppressor patients. Your master's on vaccine development, and then your PhD modeling all sorts of interesting, pharmacoeconomic dynamics between PrEP and vaccines, everything in between. Take us back a little bit. Tell us a little bit more about your background and why you started off in HIV. It's a really cool story.
I'm so impressed with your background research. Wow, that was incredible. Well, for me, it really came to when I was a child, a family member that I loved really deeply became infected with HIV. And it was a time when that was a death sentence. There weren't drugs available. And, as a child, I was just devastated with the pain that someone I loved would be hurt by something that was preventable by a virus. And so that was just a time where I really wanted to dedicate my life to being able to help other people and other families be able to not have pain that's avoidable, which is, it's so different than now this oncology space that we're in when, anyone can develop cancer and it's so difficult to prevent. But these infectious diseases where there's actual structural policy medicines that we can invent, there's just so much opportunity to help people.
It's I just being interested in the space, part of the show, and I've profiled the Gilead folks, and we've talked about PrEP, and I had Stan Plotkin on talking about HIV vaccines, and we covered one of the CCR Delta mutation cases. What's your report card for 2025 in HIV? I mean, I just love I know we're going to be talking oncology in a bit, but I just love Blythe Adamson's perspective on where we are in 2025 for HIV.
Well, we're sitting here in April of 2025, where the Trump administration has now made some very big moves
Yep.
and reduction in workforce. So I think a lot right now is uncertain. A lot has just been tossed into the air, and we have to see where the chips are going to fall. Um, it's an interesting moment in history where the policy objectives, the North Star for American policy right now is America first. And so I think there's a lot of thinking to do about what does that mean for our investment in prevention of diseases outside of the United States and inside of the United States, and what populations we think are worth American taxpayer dollars to invest in. I think for many years, there are strong economic arguments about why it benefits Americans to be able to prevent diseases that we would not like to come onshore. And I do think PEPFAR was one of the greatest accomplishments in policy accomplishments in my lifetime under George W. Bush, which really, for those who aren't familiar, was what allowed there to be access to low-cost HIV treatments in Africa and in many places around the world, where that prevented millions and millions of deaths. But we're at a different point in history. Those drugs have been around for 20 years now, and but HIV still is a burden in the United States. There are still many populations within the U.S., and I'm thinking of Black women in the Southeast that are having disproportionate rates. So it's an interesting moment in history because there also is a lot of innovation happening in the prevention space. Now we're talking about HIV, but these concepts apply to lots of diseases.
Sure.
You've got small molecule drugs that you could take every single day that are available in a generic form that could protect you from HIV. There's now injectable forms once a month, now once every 6 months, that may be in the budget of $40,000 a year to offer protection. So it's interesting to see the uptake of some of these more premium luxury prevention techniques and the uptake being used by those who can afford it, those who can access it in the United States. And then a third category, which is in the biologic space. So where now we have broadly neutralizing antibodies being developed for HIV prevention, which is an infusion that someone might get every 6 months. And antibodies, I think, offer a very different safety profile than like the HIV treatment drugs that are now being used for prevention. So it's interesting to see these different categories of like small molecule generics to on brand to the injectable form, then the long acting, broadly neutralizing antibodies. It's fascinating to see all the different technology innovations that have happened in medicine to prevent infection with a virus. And then to think, what does that mean for COVID, for MPOX, for all these other things? To me, it's an exciting moment in history that we have so many different techniques to be able to combat this and give people options for what works best for them and how we can figure out how to deliver these in a cost-effective way to the populations that can capture the most benefit.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And one thing, and we'll talk about this again when we get to oncology, the some of the parallels in terms of, the cocktail principles and how, as you were saying, here's something we've taken from a death sentence and made very livable, not just with sort of single magic bullet strategies, but really thinking across the board of how we address and ultimately cure something. So I appreciate that as well. And we'll be getting into that in a bit. Before we go there, I'd love to talk a little bit about infectious economics Economics, because this is a group that you set up, and as I mentioned in your bio, you provide thought leadership to policymakers, to industry leaders, and it's been quite interesting that the last couple of years on the show, we've had the opportunity to host many chief medical officers, not from healthcare companies, but from major industrial groups, including Pepsi, Chevron, Jaguar Land Rover. And there's sort of this very interesting move in these industries saying, look, the chief medical officer is no longer someone we keep in this back room over here. And if there's a problem, we bring them out and whatever, gives them advice. The chief medical officer, it deserves a space at the table constantly, because whether it's the health of our employees, whether it's the health of our customers, in case of Jaguar Land Rover, making cars less motion sickness prone, so forth, we need that advice. And I'd love to get some of it. I know you focus more on infectious diseases with the company, but talk a little bit about your experiences there. I watched some really interesting shows where you were advising Hollywood and Broadway during the pandemic. Talk about that a bit.
Well, and it's an interesting moment too with what's happening politically, because we are seeing more moves for the privatization of public health. So Infectious Economics is an example of a private public health company. And it really operates under the philosophy that there's an intersection between making choices that are for the good of the health of a population and what the economic consequences are from those investments. And I really believe that so much in the United States is actually driven by private businesses and led by private businesses' decisions, sometimes even in a way that's more influential than government decisions and government policy or CDC decisions. We really saw this during the pandemic when, as you mentioned, groups like Disney and the NBA were leading the reopening with bold moves, calculated risks, and understanding that, there is a balance between how do we figure out how to do what's best for the health of people, but also understand that we need to have jobs open. This is why when I was at working in the West Wing, the math models that I was building for the president for decision-making for the Pentagon included what are the consequences of, opening today versus 2 weeks on the GDP per capita at the end of the year, the unemployment rate at the end of the year, because all of these things are related to the well-being of people, the welfare of individuals. And I think that the modeling and policy decisions that were only thinking about maximizing health and not thinking about consequences like keeping schools closed for another year, or how are people supposed to get to their jobs, I think we're viewed as being so isolated, they don't even rationally make sense to an average person. And that's why I love the discipline of health economics, because it offers you the methodology, the tools to be able to incorporate a synthesis of all the different evidence that you have, to be able to measure the trade-offs between two different options that you have, and to be able to capture alignment from a diverse group of stakeholders, whether it's economists, health officials, to mutually agree on a set of assumptions and be able to calculate what the trade-offs are so you can make a decision about what to do and really reduce your uncertainty. And so for me as a health economist, when I founded Infectious Economics in 2017, it was because I really believed, hey, pandemics happen every 100 years. The last one was in 1918. So in 2017, I was like, there might be one in a year from now. And I thought that what's needed is a private leader who can help governments, businesses be able to weigh the different trade-offs of the decisions that they would need to make in an emergency situation. And so, founded in 2017 and did many, had done a lot of forecasting, the return on investment from prevention. And so I was in the right place at the right time to be helpful to the country, with a skill set that, a lifetime of preparing myself to be useful in the moment. So I was really grateful I had the opportunity to be there and generate unbiased evidence to provide so that leaders could incorporate that into decision making.
And clearly, a lot of people notice because, and you can tell us the story, but March 2020, your phone rings and it's the White House and say, Blythe, we need you here to talk about emergency responders and data and infectious disease, everything else. I've had the opportunity to profile a lot of cool OSTP people, Paul Friedrichs when he was leading preparedness office. Just tell us a little bit about your White House story, if you could, how who called you up, how you got there, and then if you could talk also a little bit about SalivaDirect, because I know that was a little an offshoot off everything that was happening in the beginning of the pandemic, and a little bit of your background there.
Yeah, I mean, the first call that I received was just looking for a second opinion on a math model. They were about to make a really difficult decision and were trying to calculate, project something about the future and what the trade-off should be. And so there aren't that many infectious disease economists around to look at supply and demand models of these types of things. So I reviewed it overnight, and the model was totally garbage. I encourage them to throw it in the trash. Like, you need to build a totally new thing. And so by 24 hours later, they were like, we need you to be in DC to come work on this. So I landed and showed up at FEMA, which was the place where all the different groups had been gathering together: CDC, the White House, the officials from the military generals. That was really the gathering point where people were trying to cobble together the evidence. So from within 24 hours, I had built a new model that ended up being very useful for decision making. And it was a frustrating moment because at that point, CDC had developed models that took more than a day to even run one simulation of it. And when faced with a decision of, are we going to have to cut in line to get ventilators from like the global supply? We need to decide in 48 hours. And the time CDC said, okay, we'll give you results from our analysis in 2 weeks. And so there was just a misalignment between some like slow academic methodology that was happening. And I think also there wasn't yet, and I'm not sure if there even still is today, a strong economic powerhouse within CDC that was able to help create models that included economic trade-offs of policy decisions. And so I felt like it was a great opportunity to bridge together the economists and the health teams by building models that everyone could agree on to use for decision making. So it was then that I started being brought into meetings at the White House and in the West Wing, and through my conversations with President Trump, was able to explain things in language and storytelling that resonated with him. I think we had effective communication exchanges when, he was also surrounded by scientists speaking in very technical language, and that may have been difficult for a layperson to understand. But I think that the benefit I had was being able to try to communicate things simply in interesting stories, and also knowing that he would care a lot about the economic consequences of these policy decisions.
Very cool. Very cool. So now we're going back a little bit now, but again, we'll put link to your Google Scholar and all that. But the themes clearly shift quite a bit from HIV to oncology in your publications. 2019, you begin to publish quite extensively on the intersection real world data, electronic health records, machine learning, large language models, and again, we'll go into a couple of these papers in a little bit, but everything from the genetics of cancer to social determinant of health papers. This really cool paper on non-smokers and non-small cell lung cancer. You got some cell of origin work, a wide range of topics, each one cooler than the next. Talk a little bit about sort of the early days of these projects. I know you were working with Flatiron previously as well, and I think that's when you started building these models and introduce us to Flatiron Health as well too, and a little bit of their model, because we've seen them. It's a company over the years we hear the name, but maybe we don't. They're not at the forefront of like some of the maybe the big pharma groups, but nonetheless behind the scenes doing a lot of really cool stuff in terms of oncology. Introduce us to the company, and then a little bit of how some of these projects fell on your desk. I mean, because they're each one again is more complex than the next, and really again looks at all the angles that one could look at in oncology. And just love to hear that background.
Wow, great questions. I might need you to, there's so much in there to unpack. I might need you
Take your
to
time.
remind them to help me steer me along the way. But I think the heart of what I hear you asking at the beginning was, what explains this drastic pivot from HIV research and math modeling to moving my children and I across the country from Seattle to New York City to work in real world data in oncology. And which is like, what would explain that? Well, in infectious diseases and in the modeling world, we say garbage in, garbage out. And the data, public health data is mostly garbage. I mean, there's not great public health data infrastructure. You maybe have aggregate information collected by the states. There's like barely anything usable. There's not great insight. So even as a mathematician, I just felt like, am I going to be writing the same equations 20 years from now and have the same bad information to plug in and try to figure out what to do? Like, this is just not a great situation for the field of infectious diseases. And as a math modeler, you wish you had great data, but nobody had great data. And so at the time, I could see that the future was going to be electronic medical records. That's where all the interesting information is hidden. It's hidden within the notes that doctors are writing. It's hidden within the faxes that get sent from the lab to the doctor's office that are then scanned in and saved within the EHR. Like, this is where all the true interesting information is captured. But I could see that technology innovation in how to pull out value from that wasn't going to be happening in HIV or, tuberculosis or malaria. That technical innovation is going to happen where there's the most money to be made. Because as an economist, there's not a lot of money in infectious diseases, like not in these public health, public good things. But oncology was a space at that moment in time where the drugs were so expensive and there was so much innovation happening of like new immunotherapies coming out, that I could see that the cutting edge of science was going to be real world data from EHR, and it would be happening in the oncology space, because that's where there was so much opportunity to be able to quickly learn things and figure out, which drugs are working well, which ones justify the high prices that were associated with these new medicines. And Flatiron Health was the first in the world to be able to discover how to do this. And so, it's really shocked all of my colleagues when I left the HIV world and, moved across the country to get access to this data and to be able to see how is it possible that they're actually doing this at scale. So Flatiron Health is a company, it's a health tech company that has access to more than 5 million cancer patients' medical records and uses the medical records to curate them and create insights about what treatments work well for what patients at what time. And this information is used for regulatory decision-making, health technology assessment around the world, and was just so incredibly powerful. And we're able to use all these sophisticated analysis methods to compare these treatments' effectiveness using real patients' experiences and data that's been de-identified and used. And so it was so meaningful for me now to, when I first moved to New York and started at Flatiron, I was like a kid in a candy store. Like there are hundreds or thousands of research questions that I could answer now that no one in the world has ever been able to answer before. And so I just like came in like gangbusters being like, ooh, which questions am I going to answer first? I was so hungry. I had access to all the most beautiful healthcare data in the world. I've worked in government, industry, nonprofit. I've worked all around the world. Flatiron's data is the most beautiful healthcare data I've ever seen in the entire world. It's curated to be like research ready. So I could show up and spend one day doing it and like taking a study from start to finish that might have taken someone like 2 years of a PhD dissertation to do. So I was really unleashed when I first arrived. I organized my thought process of which questions to answer by saying, okay, what are the research questions that maybe pharma is already going to answer with their access to this data? So I'll like exclude those. And then what are the research questions that no one else could answer without this data? And then of what's left, I rank sorted them by saying which ones, if I answered them, would create the greatest patient impact. And that's how I started to organize things. So the first one I looked at was, the Affordable Care Act. Obamacare had just happened, and nobody had recent enough data to figure out if it worked. And so I showed that the Medicaid expansion practically eliminated the racial disparities in the timely treatment of cancer patients. And that was motivated for me because, I had an experience of, living in poverty, being on food stamps, being frustrated myself with the healthcare and social systems and, just the injustice of some of these things. And so so many of my research questions are just motivated out of my own personal experience and in seeking justice in ways that patients can actually benefit from getting these questions answered. And was so thrilled to see the findings of that study then being used by Congress, and like actually used to inform policy. And it's, what's so funny is that once I was presenting that on stage, and years later, once COVID happened, I got a call from Bob Iger, the CEO of Disney. And he said, hey, I heard your name from this other CEO that says I should get your advice on closing Disney parks, opening Disney parks. And he goes, but I already knew about you because I watched you present this like racial disparities Medicaid study once and thought it was so great that I follow you on your website. And I was like, Bob Iger of Disney has been following me, follows my blog. It was just, it was really cool to see the impact and influence that made. And then to end up working so closely with Bob on Disney and the health economics and modeling and setting up the real world data systems that were used really came full circle of just having the right skill set for the moment and being able to use data and math to be able to generate intelligence that's timely and useful for decisions.
Yeah, and just as a side note, there we're a huge Disney family, and never gotten sick once. Before or after the pandemic, and we're there, dozens of times. So whatever you did was great. That was a great job. As a side note, but yeah, no, let's go back to oncology because yeah, I mean, again, a really impressive portfolio of projects here. I thought we could just touch on a couple of them, and then we'll get to the really big recent study, the international one. But I'm going to invoke, as I've done a couple times on the show, my late father-in-law, who battled metastatic prostate cancer for several years. And during that, he was handed this very complex sort of oncoproteomic, whatever profile of his tumor. And he gives it to me, and I'm like, he's like, what can you tell me? I was like, I have no idea what I can tell you about this because it literally listed like 100 genes, various levels of transcription and all that. I was very intrigued by this one paper. This was Value in Health, December 2022, on machine learning accelerated outcomes research. This is specifically focused on lung cancer, but yeah, so 159,000 patients. All stages of disease, plus all sorts of genes that you talk about here. I'm just very interested on this particular paper, but at the same time, sort of where you see a lot of the sort of the biomarker component of this going, because clearly we have personalized medicine here, the immuno-oncology stuff, more and more coming online, and then when it comes to all these genes, we really need better understanding of what it means when one's up and one's down and everything in between. Talk a little about some of your experiences there. I think it's really cool.
Yeah, I think at the heart of it, it's the discovery that medicines can work better or worse depending on these genomic biomarkers. Yeah. And many of them have only recently started being measured in patients. So there are even drugs now that have been sold on the market to treat cancer for a very, very long time, that when they ran those original clinical trials, nobody was tested for those biomarkers at the time. And now we have this field of all these different cancer drugs that are being used now, and all the ones that we want to be discovered, that we know now, depending on what your biomarkers are, different drugs may be better or worse for you individually. And to me, that means that this moment is that we need to learn from every single person that's out there where we've had your biomarker measured for, whatever testing you've had done, whatever treatments you've received, and then match you with an individual who has, whether it's a digital twin that we create that's like a synthetic version of you, or we match you with someone who's similar in all the same characteristics. They have the same biomarkers as you, but they took a different drug. Mm-hmm. And what are their outcomes? This is, I think, an incredible moment right now where we need to be doing randomized controlled trials that do test for those biomarkers and help us understand how well they work in subgroups. But we also have a responsibility to go back and look at all of the drugs in the past, because sometimes the FDA is coming out with warnings now that say this medicine that on average is good for everybody, there's actually a subgroup who this makes them worse off than if they had just had and so there's just a huge, ripe, urgent research need for us to understand as much as possible. And the scale of this gets back to something you asked me before that I didn't answer about the AI, ML, like why this is so important. Right. Some of these biomarkers are so rare, you have to manually, if we just have, 1,000 nurses full time opening up millions of patients of charts, could take years to be able to find the 100 patients of those millions that have this unique profile that we want to learn from. Mm-hmm. And we don't want to wait years. to be able to learn from that. And this is where NLP, deep learning models, LLMs, this category of being able to gain efficiency by having these models read through patients' charts in a similar way that a trained oncology nurse would be reading through the charts. Because they can, it might take an oncology nurse, the type of report you were describing, like, what does this mean?
Yeah.
Even a trained oncology nurse it would take them 45 minutes to read a report like that and be able to say, here are the details in the report that matter. Now, we can train deep learning models and use already trained large language models to be able to do that in a second instead of waiting 45 minutes. And while for one patient, it may be like, oh, that's great, it gained you 45 minutes. But when you need to learn from 1 million patients, this is where it helps you discover those rare populations that you're looking for. And we benefit at Flatiron because, I mean, anyone theoretically could take an LLM and deploy it to pull out information.
Right.
I don't know any other group that has more than 10 years, like Flatiron does, of where they've had oncology nurses doing this every single day to give you the validation data set that's needed to figure out, to either train deep learning models to do a specific thing, like pull out the date that they received the test result, or to validate, is the LLM pulling out all the information with the same accuracy that our team of trained nurses following a set of policies and procedures would, how does that accuracy compare? And it matters because if you're going to use that intelligence for regulatory decision-making, for the FDA, for HTA bodies, you want to feel we need to have the confidence that the information is high quality and accurate. Through my time working side by side with software engineers that have deep machine learning expertise, alongside oncologists who are now becoming really deeply understanding these AI models, this is where we're starting to see research be unlocked. I feel like we're at another wave of, for me, enthusiasm of all new types of questions that we can answer that nobody's been able to answer before because of the scale, the speed, and the clinical depth that's possible to pull out from charts now. So I've got a collection of peer-reviewed scientific papers that have come out in the last couple of years that have tried to make it as transparent as possible. This is exactly what we're doing. These are the types of models we're running. This is how well they're performing. This is how we're validating them, because it's not a black box secret, anymore. And a lot of people have access to the same types of LLM models, but the ability to fine tune to do specific things is really interesting. And yeah, it's an exciting moment in history to have access to the best data in the world, all that unstructured information that's language. I mean, this is what LLMs are so good at, reading right. Complex language, summarizing information. So I feel so fortunate to be living in a moment in history where this huge technology innovation happened, and then to be sitting at a company where we can deploy it in a way that creates more value than anywhere else I can see.
Absolutely. Yeah. And again, an extremely, looking at the oncogenomic stuff, an extremely elegant example. And again, this 45 minutes to 1 second. It's just extremely impressive. And that's why, that one stood out to me is, well, again, you got quite a few impressive publications here and impressive studies. But one other one I want to ask you about, just because, again, this is personal, but it's equally cool. And in November 2020, this is a Journal of Clinical Oncology Practice. You published this paper. It's entitled "Adoption of Immune Checkpoint Inhibitors and Patterns of Care at the End of Life." And I invoked my father-in-law before. Let me bring my father in now, because he died of metastatic prostate cancer 30 years ago, and his end of life, where was sort of where my father-in-law's treatment started with some really fancy antibody drug conjugates and all that. And he got 2 years of progression-free survival. So sort of like where my father's life ended, the novelty and what's happening on the immuno-oncology space, this is life. This is real life extension 101, and quality of life. I just, I love your perspective on this. I mean, I know in this you looked at the non-small cell lung cancer, colon cancer, melanoma. We really don't really always know what end of life means in oncology because things are always progressing, whether it's immuno-onc, whether it's oncolytic viruses and gene therapies, everything in between. Talk about what you learned here. I think this is another really interesting paper. Again, another way of looking at things, or another interesting thing to look at in your job jar.
Yeah, end of life conversations are so delicate.
Yeah.
And I think it's interesting too to see how societies have different values and preferences for how they want end of life handled. Do you prefer being in hospice care and having comfort care and being surrounded by your family? Or would you rather try another toxic treatment that may reduce your quality of life and make you feel miserable, but you're able to live 1 month longer? These are real trade-offs that patients have to make. It's been so valuable for me now that Flatiron doesn't just have US data, but we're now curating data in the UK, Germany, and Japan. And so I have teams of scientists in each of these countries that are analyzing patient experiences with cancer in UK, Germany, and Japan. And we even see end of life differences in choices between these countries. Sometimes it's differences in their clinical guidelines, like where the UK is like, just don't give any more treatment after this. But sometimes it is societal preferences and values of they would just rather go for to hospice and and choose this. But I think exactly what you've described is something that I'm seeing coming out in the data, is that there are certain cancer types where we know that more aggressive treatment at the end really can gain you a lot of life. And I can see that contrasted with countries where they say, we end treatment here. In the US, we have access to many more cancer medicines, at least much sooner than access in these other countries. Like we get cancer drugs 18 to 24 months before most Europeans get access to them. And we're able to see that even allowing, like, if in Europe, maybe a patient gets like 3 different lines of treatment and then they stop there. In the US, sometimes they get 8, 9, 10 different rounds of different kinds of treatment. So we are starting to learn, when does that actually really gain you quality of life, length of life that's meaningful to a patient, where they would want to do that at the end, versus when is it actually not gaining you enough that we should be counseling patients differently. So it's a whole fascinating area of research that deserves attention.
Another really cool paper, but yeah, I appreciate your feedback on that. So yeah, I mean that leads to the really big paper that it just came out a couple weeks ago, European Society for Medical Oncology, real world data and digital oncology perspective, characterization of oncology EHR derived real world data in UK, Germany, and Japan. Again, broad things to think about in terms of, as you were just saying, how we treat oncology, how it's reimbursed, how we govern the data. If I'm a whatever, a company X, and I'm running my multi-centered, multi-country oncology study everywhere. Got to understand the differences and all the ramifications. Again, take your time with this one and a little bit of set this one up, and then a little bit of what you learned about the differences or the similarities between some of these systems.
Yeah. Well, let's first set the stage with what was available before in these countries. And I'd say not much. There are some good cancer registries, and we know that Nordic countries have some high quality cancer registries that, many academics have learned from. There are some claims databases. So we know that for, billing reimbursement, that you, at least some countries, know what drugs are being prescribed, but you maybe don't know the outcomes. Like, did they progress? Did they respond to that treatment? How long did they live? A lot of that, all that is missing from a lot of those databases. And then there's the privacy laws that are really different in Europe and Asia. So in the EU, you have GDPR, which is for individual people's data privacy. And in Japan, you've got AAPI. And so what that practically means is that for many health data sets, they've never been allowed to leave the country. And so researchers have to live within that country, do the analysis in that country, and then they can maybe share the results of their analysis with people around the world. But you were never before able to take individual patients' experiences and combine them together across countries until now. So the huge technology breakthrough that has been a game changer now are trusted research environments. So these are cloud-based, secure platform environments where the data can exist in an instance where an analyst from anywhere in the world can log in, open up, RStudio, a Jupyter notebook for Python coding, and then be able to bring into that environment de-identified or anonymized patient-level data from multiple different countries in a way that is compliant with the local laws and regulations in each country. And this took Flatiron 5-6 years to be able to figure out how to navigate the compliant way to respectfully handle this patient information. And now what's possible for us is we integrate within each country. We have partnerships with the hospitals like NHS Trust in the UK, the small community clinics in Germany, because cancer is treated in different ways in different countries. So you really have to partner with where patients are receiving their care. And it's different depending on the healthcare system, and the cancer centers in Japan. And so we integrate with them. Sometimes that involves even bringing installing servers in the basements of these hospitals to get real-time data integrations. And then we have our teams within each country of software engineers, research oncologists, the clinical abstractors that are then curating these data sets with a common data model for each of the cancer types we're interested in. And this is key because one of the other limitations of what existed before was that the data sets available in different countries, you could never combine them. Also because the variables are totally different. Like one person describes progression this way, one person defines line of therapy a totally different way. You couldn't really do a global study with different countries' data sets because they were all built completely differently by different groups. And now in our efforts with Flatiron, these multinational data sets, we've built them to be harmonized with each other. So performance status, like a patient's frailty, we're defining that in the same way so that when there's content validity of these mean the same thing. So when we pool together the data sets, all of the variables completely line up and we can just add all of those patients together to learn from their experience in ways where we're making fair comparisons. So as you mentioned, the types of research questions we can answer now. So sometimes we're looking at differences between countries where maybe Germany treats patients this way and Japan treats them this way. And we want to know, are patients ending up better or worse following these different types of clinical guidelines? And another type of research question that you were alluding to before are these global studies. And some of that's based on the FDA's feedback to us saying you were interested in real world data being used for these external control arms. But you have a global single arm clinical trial. But then if the external control arm's only from the United States, is that really a fair comparison to take real world data only from the US and then compare it to a global clinical trial? Like, is that really fair? So now what's possible is to make a global external control arm that includes data from these 4 countries that we have access to now, where we've curated them for the purposes of being able to understand patients' experiences on the same drug. So it's pretty powerful to be able to unlock these studies now.
Yeah, it's again, it's it's going to be interesting to see what comes next. Again, you have the AI tools, this amazing data set. You understand the rules across territories. So yeah, it's all extremely impressive. What I mean, what sort of comes next? What's coming up on the horizon that, I mean, obviously nothing confidential, but and where are you taking this next? And what are some of the tools? I mean, I know you mentioned digital twins before. We've talked about things like distributed clinical trials and I'm talking out of my sphere here because I'm not a health tech person, but I mean, what sort of, we'll look a little bit over the horizon. Obviously Flatiron is positioned in an awesome spot, but what's next? I mean, take us a little into your vision of the next year or so, and what other exciting things you hope to do with this tool set.
Yeah. Well, bigger picture, some of the things that are possible now that at Flatiron that I'm seeing huge excitement and adoption of now that we've got this scale, we've built the infrastructure, we have AI tools. As you said, we've got great prediction models. So those can be used for clinical decision support tools. We also have prediction models of who's going to be eligible for this clinical trial. So we're actively, we've built tools that are now accelerating the enrollment time of clinical trials. So it's shortening the time that you can enroll patients by surfacing to physicians at the point of care, this patient's likely eligible for this study, and you should have a conversation with them. We're also doing prospective studies now. So real world data used to just be retrospective. We'd look into the past to past patients' experiences. Now we do prospective studies all the time where we're doing intentional data collection. So they're not necessarily interventional, like we're not assigning patients to receive a drug, but we are collecting more complete information because prospectively, we know we want to learn from this patient's experience. And so let's make sure we have all the information that we really want. So sometimes they call it ambispective, like prospective and retrospective together. So there's a lot more creative ways that I'm seeing things be built. But I'd say bigger picture, where are things going in 2030, 2040? AI has already started to transform things. But a key is, are you building the infrastructure that's necessary to have these models perform in a way they're reliable, validated, including all of the privacy considerations that are necessary. So the infrastructure to be able to use the AI models that are out there to be able to extract value. So I think all of it is just moving. All of it ideally will shorten the time from discovery of a drug to when patients get access to it. For drugs that are already on the market, ideally it'll mean across medicines that patients and physicians and regulators will have access to more information about what the best drugs are for what patients at the right time. I think the gamble that we'll have to wait to see how it pays off will probably be in the drug discovery stage.
Sure.
There's so much hype right now happening with AI for target discovery. And, I'd love to see someone's business model claims like that pays off. But the
Yeah.
truth, we have to wait 8 to 12 years to
Yeah.
know if a company predicting and selecting targets today actually works in humans as something effective. So there is an amount of hope I have of that, like 2030 to 2040 will be so interesting to look back and do the comparisons of the companies that chose to do the traditional way of identifying new medicines. What was their hit rate? What was their success rate versus companies that chose to use more data and more AI to inform their target and drug selection? Do they actually have a higher probability of success? And that's something that we're going to have to wait 10 years to be able to test.
Yeah. I was laughing there because a couple of years ago I had a venture capitalist on, and it was like March or something. I forget when the interview was, but they were like, so far this year they had seen, I remember the number, it was 182 business plans that had something to do with AI and drug discovery. I was like, it was only 3 months into the year. I'm like, oh, okay. But yeah, I'm with you on that one. It's going to be interesting come 2040 or whatever that may be to see if how good beats traditional drug discovery 101. But yeah, that'll be enlightening. But interesting. Uh, but what else is coming up while we have you today? I notice you get out on the conference circuit quite a bit. I know there's a Professional Society for Health Economics and Outcomes Research meeting that's coming up in a couple months. You're gonna, I think, be talking about the Canadian cancer system there. What else is happening for the year? Where else can we watch you, run into you, and meet you? Anything else on the calendar for 2025 that we should know about while we have you today? And anything else you want to talk about, please?
Oh, thank you. Wow. Yes, I do end up on the conference circuit a lot. I love ISPOR as that professional society. I'll be at their US and their EU meetings that happen this fall, but I think I'm going to be showing up a lot at these European cancer conference meetings, Japanese cancer conference meetings, because this is where I think there's the most exciting brand new things that are happening, and a
Mm,
lot of that's enabled by this new infrastructure that Flatiron's built that allows us to be able to learn from the EHR data in those countries. So, some of my attention has been pivoted away from the US because a lot of that stuff is already in motion now and being built. But now there's a lot of education and understanding and exploration that has to happen with what is Europe going to look like now that
yeah.
it's that we've overcome this the perception that GDPR was going to block innovation. And now we've proved that it hasn't blocked it, that there are ways to be able to be compliant with it. So if anyone's listening who's coming to some of these European cancer meetings like ESMO or even general ones like ISPOR EU, come find me. Or if you're in Tokyo, I'm there often with my team.
Excellent. Outstanding. Not really, really impressive. I enjoy this space very much. Again, I love seeing the very elegant way that you say merging all this data and the LLMs and the AHR structure. And yeah, I just I think it's awesome. I wish you and the team the best with this as you continue to move these strategies forward and come up, ultimately with new clinical care models and ultimately hopefully new drug discovery systems, but really great stuff. Again, for everybody that's going to be listening to this episode across the various podcast networks or who'll be watching on the YouTube channel, again, you've been spending time with Dr. Blythe Adamson, Head of Outcomes Research and Evidence Generation at Flatiron Health, where she's helping to lead their strategy, as they say, to reimagine the infrastructure of cancer care. Blythe, I want to thank you again for taking the time out of your schedule to talk about a range of topics. Very, very interesting stuff. Obviously, thank you for all you do on the oncology space. And as we like to say on our show, thanks for helping to create a better tomorrow for millions of patients via what you do. Really an awesome story.
Thank you. It was a pleasure to be here.
Great having you today. Really great having you.